how are you?
Fantastic, sir.
Nice to see you. Just came
you?
by to say hello to you.
Thank you.
Say we're delighted. Congratulations on your book. You know,
Good to see you again. How are you, Charles? Very good to see you.
We're honored to have you here.
Stay for 1 minute, are you running?
No, we've got a whole series of administrative meetings going on, budget and all the rest of it, so I just want to come by and say. He'll be doing well? Well, there she is right here. Well, terrific. And Tom, I want to say hello to Tom when he comes in. I'm kind of surprised he made it. I thought they were going to be voting this afternoon.
He said that even if they vote, he was going to come.
He'd be.
Svetlana.
Volunteer. I did have to invite him. He read it one night.
Oh, he did.
The whole
They
book?
couldn't put,
He said he couldn't put it down.
That's what the net says. That's what the net says. So I don't know what else to say.
Oh, very good.
You know each other? This is Ambassador Shimoni of the Republic of Hungary. And this is Congressman Lee Hamilton, the president of this whole place.
We're delighted to have you here, sir.
Archie, how are you?
Good, good.
Well, it's an honor.
Very,
I was
very
going to
good.
cite you if you stayed, but this way I won't.
No.
I don't know if you remember this. Can I tell you a story? You have enough time for me? Once I appeared several times before the subcommittee, and there was one time when I made a comment, just talking as I like to do, that when Soviet rule ends, then this and this might happen.
Hi, Toby. How are you? Good to see you.
See you on television all the time.
Welcome to the
That's
center.
for sure.
About half the country likes what you have to say.
And
So
go
I
ahead.
said that, and then I went on, and then you caught this half sentence of when Soviet rule says, and he said, Professor Gotti, when will Soviet rule end? And I said, I can't give you a date, but I will say this, in your lifetime and in mine.
You had it right.
For once, I was right.
You
I
were
made so
right.
many bad things that I don't mind showing off with one that turned out to be right.
When was that?
I would say in the early 80s.
Quite a ways ahead of time then, wasn't it?
Yeah. Well, I didn't know how it was. I made it up. Don't think I was. I knew what I was saying.
You're going to comment on your book, and I may be able to get some of it upstairs on the website, so we'll try to do that. We have. I'm only in town 2 days this week, and that means I have to do all the administrative meetings here. And we're right in the budget cycle, so you know what that means for any organization.
Can't really imagine.
I haven't seen Tom in a while, so I hope things are going well
Should
for
be on
him.
his way. I bet he will be here in 2 minutes. I want to explain to him exactly where to get off. This is a difficult place if you don't know
It is. It
find.
really is. You bet
So I
it is.
told him Moynihan Plaza, the restaurant, and so on. So
I think he's been here before. I think I'm right about that. I don't know. I think he may be coming in now. So yeah, here he is.
He's on
we'll
time.
see
I knew
him
he
Whatever
here.
you want.
He's on the-
I don't know, you want to trade questions? You want to
Tom,
be
come on.
No, C-SPAN get confused?
Okay.
Good year.
Tom, how are you?
Like old times.
How are you? Good to see you. Your ties are improving.
Hi, Jim Hirschberg. Nice to see you.
Hi, how are
Hi, Lee.
you? Good to see you again. Good to be here.
Good to see you back here.
Nice of you to come here, Tom. Annette is here as well.
That's a break from Iraq and our current dismal condition. This is a great read.
I have it on my, I have it upstairs. I've not looked at it, but I will.
Because, even though, the cover implies this is another grim subject, Charles writes with this wry Central European sensibility and approach, as well as an authoritative scholarly view that makes this a tremendously interesting read. So
Good.
I just want to recommend it.
I know I'll read it just because I'm Charles Sewell. I'll read it. But you're right.
I have a meeting I'm running to. I'm sorry.
Thank you for coming.
It's my great pleasure. Very good. We'll get started. Fine. We're just
missing Charles.
Mr. Congress.
Okay.
Did you get the copy?
Could I have paper and pencil? Yes.
Did you get the copy
All-
from California?
I think I have everything.
In which I wrote long.
Yeah. That's not what I. No.
This is all. Careful.
Okay.
Sure.
I think that's. Okay, please take your seats. We'd like to get started. Ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center. My name is Christian Osterman. I direct the center's History and Public Policy program, and I'd like to welcome you on behalf of Lee Hamilton and the center staff. The Wilson Center is the official U.S. memorial to Woodrow Wilson, our 28th president. As both a distinguished scholar, the only American president with a PhD, and a national leader, Wilson felt strongly that the scholar and the policymaker were engaged in a common enterprise. Here at the center, we commemorate the ideals and concerns of Woodrow Wilson by providing a link between the world of ideas and the world of policy, and by fostering research, study, discussion, and collaboration among a full spectrum of individuals concerned with policy and scholarship in national and international affairs. Directed by former Congressman Lee Hamilton, the center hosts about 150 scholars annually and holds over 400 meetings on international and national affairs. The center's History and Public Policy program seeks to provide historical context to current public policy issues and a forum for the discussion of new, significant, and policy-relevant historical findings and publications, such as Charles Gatti's new book, Failed Illusions, provide such a forum in the heart of the nation's capital. Many of you may be familiar with one of our core activities, the Cold War International History Project, which for the past decade and a half has spearheaded a global effort to unlock, translate, and disseminate new documents and perspectives on the history of the Cold War, in particular from the previously inaccessible archives of what we used to call the other side, the former communist world. I believe some of Charles's findings are based on documents published by this program, and we're delighted to see them being put to such good use. We publish a Cold War Project bulletin of newly declassified and translated documents. There are copies for you outside. And all of our documents and other materials can be downloaded at no charge to you from our website at wilsoncenter.org. Before I introduce our distinguished speakers, let me say a few words of thanks. This meeting is co-sponsored by the Center's East and West European Studies programs, directed by Martin Schlesinger and Associate Director Sam Wells, respectively, as well as by the Wilson Center Press, directed by Joe Brindley. I think all of them are in the back there, which has co-published a book under discussion with Stanford University Press. Let me also acknowledge the kind and generous support by former U.S. Ambassador to Hungary, Nancy Brinker, who helped underwrite the reception we invite you to after the end of this panel. We also thank the Hungarian American Association, the Cold War Museum, and the Hungarian embassies, as well as our partners at George Washington University in support of this event. Finally, a word of thanks to my staff, in particular Ryan Gage, who you've probably met outside and who has helped to put this event together. For the discussion of Dr. Gatti's new book, we have a most distinguished panel of speakers for you today. Let me introduce them in the order in which they will speak. Charles Gatti is a political scientist who fled his native Hungary during the 1956 revolt and is now senior adjunct professor of European Studies at Johns Hopkins University. His previous positions have included teaching Central and Eastern European as well as Russian politics and foreign policy at Union College and Columbia University. He has served as a senior advisor on the State Department's policy planning staff in the early 1990s. His publications include his seminal The Bloc That Failed, Soviet-East European Relations in Transition, 1990, as well as Hungary and the Soviet Bloc, 1986. And of course, he is the author of Failed Illusions, Moscow, Washington, Budapest, and the 1956 Hungarian Revolt, which was just released a few days ago. He is just back from a book tour through Hungary, where I take it he is now a household name. Charles, we're very pleased to have you here today and to launch your book with you at this event. We also have the great privilege and honor to be joined by Congressman Tom Lantos. Congressman Lantos has served as member of the United States Congress since 1981. And he's currently serving his 13th term in the House of Representatives. Congressman Lantos was born in Budapest in 1928 and was 16 years old when Nazi Germany occupied his native country. As a teenager, he was a member of the anti-Nazi underground and later of the anti-communist student movement. He's the only Holocaust survivor ever to serve in the U.S. Congress. Congressman Lantos was awarded an academic scholarship to study in the United States in 1947 and later earned his PhD in economics from the University of California, Berkeley. For 3 decades prior to his service in Congress, from 1950 to 1980, Congressman Lantos was a professor of economics, an international affairs analyst for public television, as well as a consultant to a number of businesses. He also served in senior advisory roles to members of the United States Senate. As the ranking Democratic member of the House International Relations Committee, Congressman Lantos has been an advocate for strong international involvement, participation in international organizations, and human rights. In 1983, he was the founder of the Congressional Human Rights Caucus, and he continues to serve as its co-chairman. We greatly appreciate your taking the time, Congressman Lantos, to be here with us at the Wilson Center today. I understand you may at some point have to leave early if a vote is called, but we hope you can stay with us as long as possible. Finally, I'm delighted to introduce Professor James Hirschberg, who directed the Cold War International History Project from 1991, from its founding to 1996, before moving to George Washington University in 1997. He now edits the Cold War Project's book series and has, of course, been involved heavily in the production of the volume we're about to launch today. Professor Hirschberg is the author of James B. Conant, Harvard to Hiroshima and the Making of the Nuclear Age, published in 1993, a study of the former Harvard president, atomic bomb project administrator, diplomat, and educational commentator. He received the 1994 Stuart Burnoff Prize from the Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations. Other scholarly and popular articles have focused on topics related to the Cold War and nuclear history, such as the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Vietnam and Afghanistan wars, and the Iran-Contra affair. He received his AB from Harvard, master's from Columbia, and a PhD from Tufts University in 1989. Most recently, he's been a public policy scholar here at the Wilson Center. And Jim, it's wonderful to have you back. Now let me turn over the floor to Professor Gatti, who will speak for a few minutes about his book. Then we'll be immediately followed by Congressman Lantos and Professor Hirschberg. Later on, we'll open up the discussion for your questions and comments. Thank you for being here, Professor Gatti.
Thank you very much. The decision maker here is Dr. Osterman, and he gave me up to 30 minutes to speak, but I'll take only 20 in order to give ample time for Congressman Lantos and Professor Hirschberg to praise me and my book. I'd like to thank Congressman Lantos to be here, that he's here, that Mrs. Lantos has come as well. I'm very pleased that the other commentator will be Jim Hirschberg, a friend, my editor, a brilliant scholar and a great friend. And I can say truthfully that without his constant prodding and encouragement, this book would not have been written. I'd like to mention that Ambassador András Simonyi of the Republic of Hungary is here. There has never been a more dynamic ambassador from that country in this city. I'd like to welcome Dr. Bob and Dr. Kay King from Congressman Lantos's staff. And I don't know if they are here. I assume they are. Joe Brinley and Millie Kahn of the Wilson Center Press. I thank Mr. Osterman and his wonderful staff for bringing about this meeting. And I should mention that my wife, Toby, is here, and my book is dedicated to her. Let me just go back a second and I say another word or two about Congressman Lantos. We have been friends for quite a while, and he read my book when it was still unfinished, and I am told by Mrs. Lantos that he stayed up all night and read it. There is no better witness than a wife on such things, and I'm gratified that he took the time and the trouble to do so, and I'm very delighted that you are here today, and thank you for that. We're talking about a book on the 50th anniversary of the Hungarian Revolution. Let me start out by saying that that revolution was a very significant event in the Cold War. It ended the first post-Stalin hopes for détente. Let me just recall here, this is a knowledgeable audience, that in 1955, the Soviet Union from one day to the next decided to get out of Austria, something it had not been willing to do for 10 years. In 1955, after calling Marshal Tito of Yugoslavia a chained dog of imperialism. I don't know if that language still means anything to anybody anymore. Some of us like that. They had a way of telling it the way it was, right? And then one day, Khrushchev arrived at the airport in Belgrade and said, "Dear Comrade Tito." Well, that was a surprise event in the post-Stalin era. In 1955, there was a summit meeting between President Eisenhower and the Soviet leaders for the first time in 10 years. In February 1956, the very important historic 20th Party Congress took place in the Soviet Union that signified the end of Stalinism, at least on paper. But then all these hopes accumulated over a period of a year and a half. All these hopes were shattered on the streets of Budapest when, after 13 days, Soviet tanks crushed the revolt. This was the significance of Hungary for the Cold War. For Hungarians, the significance was greater. In a small country can't be proud of as many events as we can in this country. And I'll just mention to you that a soccer player in the 1950s by the name of Puskás was somebody that everybody in Hungary knew, and as a matter of fact, everybody in the world. I have an optometrist on Wisconsin Avenue here who can't remember my name, but he knows that I'm of Hungarian background. He calls me Puskás. And then there was at the State Department, there was a fellow there who talked to me only about Béla Bartók. And so actually some of us started to calling him Bartók because I couldn't remember his name. In any case, a few names, of course many Hungarians in this country made a name for themselves, such as Congressman Tom Lantos here. But 1956 was a year and an event when the whole world paid attention to what the Hungarians were doing and admired greatly, and still does, the bravery, the courage of those people. My book is based on this story, the David and Goliath theme, which is to say a powerful imperialist country attacked a small one that wanted to be free and independent. But 50 years later, I decided that that time was right to ask some more uncomfortable questions as well, questions that have not been asked systematically before. One, was the Soviet intervention inevitable? And two, could the Hungarians and could we Americans have done something so that the inevitable, or what seemed inevitable, might not have happened? Well, let me go through these 2 points today. There is much more in the book, by the way, if you care to read it. Was the Soviet intervention inevitable? My answer is no. The general reasons for this conclusion has already been stated. Austria, Tito, Geneva, 20th Party Congress. Change is happening and in the air, in foreign affairs, and of course domestically in the Soviet Union. The Gulag opened up. Socialist legality, if anybody still remembers that misnomer, was taking place, or was being implemented more or less. And of course a new economic course started. Now, aside from these general reasons, there were specific reasons as well, which is to say that Soviet relations with the satellites in general and with Hungarians in particular were under review. We now know that a general review began in the summer of 1956, something that was eventually published, I'll come to that in just a moment, on October 31st. But even before that, after the death of Stalin, the Soviet Union paid a lot of attention to the Hungarians. The Stalinist dictator, Mátyás Rákosi, was ousted in 1953, and the relatively moderate Bukharinite, another word that probably few of you remember, Imre Nagy was promoted. Then in 1955, Nagy was ousted, and then Rákosi made a comeback. In short, policy towards Hungary was in flux. The struggle for power in Moscow was the main reason for that flux, but things were happening. Now, this is the history of it. In 56 itself, something I cannot detail here at greater length, I just like to say something that has not been properly appreciated or discussed. On the 30th of October, 7 days after the revolt had started, the Presidium of the Soviet Communist Party, known as the Politburo, voted unanimously, of course in great secret, against military intervention. I'd like to repeat that. They met on the 30th of October and they voted against military intervention, preferring a political solution. This is not to say that they were ready to give up Hungary. One cannot be that naive. But they believed that through political methods, by the use of political methods, they might be able to get most of what they want. A decision they reversed the very next day on October 31st. This brings me to the second question that I want to raise here today. What did the Hungarians do that made victory impossible? Or did they do anything that made victory impossible? Well, I have a long list here, and I will present this in outline form. They rejected, of course, this was a revolution, not a reformist movement, they rejected half solutions. They could not embrace the idea that something is better than nothing. The revolutionaries overestimated their power and clearly underestimated the military power of the Soviet Union. Their cause was just. We have to emphasize that these days. Their cause was just. And they thought that justice was more important than accepting Soviet-imposed limits on their goals. The leadership, if I may add here, the leadership, primarily Imre Nagy and his colleagues, did not rise to the occasion. Number one, on 23-24 October, when the revolution began, Nagy missed the chance to temper the young revolutionaries' excessive goals. Had he done so at that time, the revolution might have taken an altogether different course, certainly far less violent than it was. Number two, Nagy did not even support the revolution for 4 days, and therefore missed the chance, again, to exert his authority, which was actually, his credibility was incredible. He was the only politician on the scene who had any credibility. Once he embraced the revolutionaries, about 4 or 5 days later, Imre Nagy did not sit down with them and put a map on the table and say, hey, look, fellas, this is the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union has so many tanks, so many people, so many weapons, so many people in the military. And this is where it is, next door to us. This is where we are, a small country, at that time 9.5 million. We have so many tanks, so many weapons, and so many people in our military. We have to seek a political solution. This did not happen. And I think, very unfortunately, on October 30th, the date here is very important, the very day when the Soviet leadership had just decided to seek a political solution, that day, the Hungarian government, led by Nagy, was unable to prevent a massacre of communists on Republic Square, a relatively rare event in the revolution. It was the worst case when communists were on the lampposts. Now, all this contributed on October 31st to the Soviet reversal of the decision not to intervene militarily. Let me turn then to the role of the United States. What did the United States do that was also unhelpful? Well, on the one hand, the United States encouraged the Hungarians to attempt a home run rather than getting a single, mainly through Radio Free Europe. On the other hand, the United States had no plans whatsoever, no means, no instruments, no tools to assist a successful outcome. I use, ironically, the phrase NATO, NATO, to describe American non-policy. NATO stands for no action, talk only. The talk was liberation, the talk was rollback. But it was to be the rollback of Democrats from Congress. Luckily, Congressman Lentos wasn't there to be victimized by them, not Soviet power from Eastern Europe. As often the case, I'm sorry to say, domestic politics was the key to what we did or did not do, and especially and in particular, fear of the McCarthy wing of the Republican Party was a critical factor in the loud and noisy political rhetoric. In addition to that, and that of course is a big theme I cannot discuss here, domestic political culture in this country did not favor the pursuit of limited goals, such as Titoism. We tend to have, we're a big country, ambitious, that often serves us well. After all, this country saved Europe from itself 3 times in the 20th century, and that is a very positive thing to mention here. But when it comes to limited goals, which under some circumstances are essential, that is not our forte. The State Department did not have any plans for diplomatic assistance. The CIA, which declassified critical operative files for my use, it turns out the CIA, listen to this, had only one agent in Budapest then. He was at the embassy. He is alive, by the way, lives outside of Washington. He was busy accepting petitions by the legation as the only Hungarian-speaking official at the U.S. legation in Budapest. Radio Free Europe, but also the U.S. government, opposed Imre Nagy throughout, even though he had proved himself to be a good prime minister and a patriot already in 1953-55. But Washington seemed to believe that when you've seen one commie, you've seen them all. And Radio Free Europe referred to the temporary Nagy government during much of that late October. I will add here, sadly, that this was not some Hungarian emigres at RFE who talked like that. In July 1956, Vice President Nixon said at a secret NSC meeting, and I will quote, "It wouldn't be an unmixed evil from the point of view of U.S. interest if the Soviet iron fist were to come down again on the Soviet bloc." End quote. I'll add to this that RFE during the revolution, while this is not a typical comment, this is probably the worst. But I'll use it now because I'm not doing what I do in the book, which is try to be, judicious and fair. But just for effect, let me just I want you to have a sense of the kind of thing Hungarian revolutionaries heard from the United States. A broadcast on October 26, 3 days after the revolt started, and it said, quote, "You, Imre Nagy, must stop. Drop on your knees as penitent sinner before the nation. Try to make amends for the terrible crime of forcing on us these Soviet legions. If you still want to give some meaning to your misguided life, then shout stop to the Soviet mercenaries whom you have hideously let loose on the nation. After that, hands up, surrender to the nation's irresistible will." End quote. In other words, those huge goals of the revolutionaries should not be limited, should not be tempered. Let me add to this, not all broadcasts were as inflammatory as this, and after 1956, Radio Free Europe changed. The review was comprehensive, and in my view, this was just an ugly chapter in what turned out to be a very positive story. What could we have done? What could the U.S. have done? The answer in 2 words: temper expectations. On October 26, the very day when this inflammatory broadcast was heard that I just cited, that very day, Walter Lippmann wrote wisely in the Washington Post and Times Herald, it was called then that, quote, "In the interest of peace and freedom from both despotism and anarchy, we must hope that for a time, not forever, but for a time, the uprising in the satellite orbit will be stabilized at Titoism." End quote. In other words, there were people who understood then what should have been done. A concluding word. In 1956, the Cold War could have been eased and some sort of détente developed. And Hungarians could have obtained partial gains, semi-independence, semi-freedom, not complete independence, not complete freedom. The illusions, that's in the title of my book, the illusions that prevailed then canceled chances for a successful outcome. The Americans and the Hungarians both believed in the illusion of total victory over communism, not partial gains. In other words, they didn't try to getting a single. And secondly, the Soviets, having considered a political alternative, repaired to the illusion of stabilizing the region by military, quote-unquote, solutions. This is the story of 1956, and this is the story of my book. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm delighted and honored to be here with my friend, Professor Gari, and to say a few candid things about the book and about the situation in '56. The book, by the way, is brilliant, incisive, a phenomenal read, one of the best political history vignettes I have ever read. And I am here to pay tribute to Charles' brilliance and knowledge and incredible writing skill. I did stay up the whole night, and it was well worth it. As I read the book, an old saying of many years ago kept reverberating in my ears. You remember the story of the diplomat. The diplomat, when he says no, he means maybe. When he says maybe, he means no. And if he says no, he is not a diplomat. And the lady who, when she says no, she means maybe. If she says maybe, she means yes. And if she says yes, she is no lady. Well, to expect of Hungarians to be balanced, judicious, half a loaf, moderate, thoughtful, serious, long-range thinking is an absurdity. And while Charles is absolutely right about how the United States could have and should have played this differently, how even the Kremlin could have and should have played it differently, I have great difficulty visualizing any Hungarian political leadership, and certainly the courageous young and not so young Hungarian man in the street, most of them bona fide heroes, to have played this differently. The greatest Hungarian poet who characteristically died in his 20s in the 1848-1849 revolution, Alexander Petőfi, whose fabulous poems I memorized and can still recite, in his most famous lines says, and I shall translate for the half a dozen of you who do not fluently speak Hungarian. He says, rabok legyünk vagy szabadok? Ez a kérdés. Válasszatok. A magyarok istenére esküszünk, esküszünk. Rabok tovább nem leszünk. Translation: should we be slaves or should we be free? We have been slaves far too long. We swear upon the God of Hungarians, we shall never be slaves anymore. These lines are part and parcel of every Hungarian's soul. This is not a carefully adjusted political position of a half a loaf. We are the people on horseback who took on the whole universe. We are the people in Hungary who say, with characteristic modesty, if the globe, shall I do it in Hungarian first? No? If the globe is God's hat, Hungary is the bouquet on it. These are not people who compromise. They want it all or they want nothing. They want to win or they want to go down in flames. Among the favorite books I have is a series of fabulous histories, the What If series. Most of you are familiar with them. They take great historical events of 2,000 years ago or the Second World War And then they ask, what if? What if this attempt at killing Hitler would have been successful? What if something else happened? In 1,000 situations. With respect to 1956, Charles has written an absolutely brilliant book. All the players could have displayed a modicum of judgment, balance, perspective. It would have been smarter from the point of view of the Kremlin to give a little. The Hungarian uprisings' brutal suppression gave them a black eye of unprecedented proportions. We were humiliated. We said we shall roll back the Iron Curtain. We told them how to make Molotov cocktails. We taught them on the radio how to make Molotov cocktails. And when these courageous, dreamy, unrealistic people took on the mighty Soviet Union, and in 1956 the Soviet Union looked enormously mighty, enormously mighty. Many of you here just remember the last decade or so, or the Brezhnev period, when the Soviet Union was increasingly becoming an empty shell. In 56, they were no empty shell. We were hoping that Western Europe will not be taken by them, and had it not been for NATO, we would now be looking at a Soviet-controlled Europe. But the Hungarians couldn't play it any differently. I think my friend Charles, who doesn't like the Hungarians having behaved like the poet Alexander Petőfi urged them to behave, should we be slaves or should we be free? Petőfi didn't ask, should we be a little less slave-like? Should we have a modicum of freedom? Perhaps a more gentle Soviet overlordship? That's not what the poem says. Every single young Hungarian can recite this entire poem to you. And it's a clear dichotomy. Rabok legyünk, vagy szabadok. Should we be slaves or should we be free? And they opted to try to be free. So my comment on the book is that apart from being brilliant and unbelievably accurate in a historical sense, and raising the right questions with respect to all the players except the Hungarians, is one of the most remarkable products of a person I consider the greatest scholar of Central and Eastern Europe alive today. Charles has a knowledge and an analytical capability and an insight that is brilliant. And of course, his hero is not Alexander Petőfi. He may be my hero. Charles's hero is another great Hungarian, whom he mentions in the book, Deák Ferenc, Francis Deák, who played the pivotal role in the 1867, I am embarrassed to use the word, compromise. I whisper it to you one more time. Compromise. Now, in every good Hungarian's vocabulary, dictionary, he goes to the dictionary and gets his scissors and cuts out the word compromise. A Hungarian doesn't need that word compromise. And what my friend Charles is looking for is a Hungarian leadership and the Hungarian revolutionary mob, drunk with power, opposing Soviet tanks, the mighty Red Army. And the fact that they do not do what maybe Karl Rove does in Pennsylvania to win the Senate race. I mean, this is not a calculating political crowd. This is a full-blooded revolutionary mob. And they were heroes. Many were killed. Tens of thousands had to leave the country. And of course, they witnessed, those who survived, 50 years later, as a result of the extraordinary efforts of Hungary's extraordinary ambassador, Ambassador András Simonyi, an incredible event here in Washington this year. A ceremony in the State Department with a spectacular speech by our Secretary of State, and a tribute in Statuary Hall in the Congress of the United States with the Republican Speaker, the Democratic Leader of the House, Nancy Pelosi, and the two Senate leaders, Frist and Reid, and the President of the United States paying tribute to 56, and the President of the United States flying into Budapest for a one-day visit on Gellért Mountain on the Buda side, personally recognizing the heroism of the people who participated in 56. I cannot urge you strongly enough to spend tonight reading Charles' book. It will be a night well spent. I apologize, but I have to go back to Congress. I'd love to stay and continue this.
Good afternoon. I'm Jim Hirschberg, and I will try to be as brief as possible so we can move to questions and comments for Charles. Unlike my two illustrious predecessors, my Hungarian is more or less limited to the phrase egészségedre, which is what one says when one is making a toast late at night in Budapest, and the words chamois sponge cake, which is more or less the Hungarian form of tiramisu. And my wife and I have gone on several chamois sponge cake crawls from one cafe to another across Budapest. What this meant is that despite my voracious appetite for Cold War historical literature, my ability to devour Hungarian documents and scholarship is somewhat limited. And therefore, the pleasure I had in prodding, as he so kindly says, but really the pleasure was all mine in terms of consuming Charles's manuscript was just indescribable, because really this book, aside from the brilliance which you've already heard it lauded with, it is an exemplary piece of the new Cold War international history, but not just that, it's part of a new wave of the new Cold War international history. 10 years ago this month, Charles and Christian and several others in the audience, I hope, were in Budapest for a conference marking the 40th anniversary of the events that Charles writes about. And it was an absolutely remarkable week. As Timothy Garton Ash remarked, and some others analyzed, it was this confluence in a graph in which there were enough witnesses of the event still alive to give it immediacy, and yet enough sources had emerged, thanks in this case to the revolutions of 1989, to allow historians to delve behind the exterior manifestations of the events. And so it was an amazing, exciting, thrilling week of new revelations. And yet, that excitement was not yet reflected in the scholarship in the sense of what Charles is talking about, judgment and balanced wisdom in terms of a more detached attitude. It was much more the first flush of waving documents that one has liberated from the archives. 10 years later, Charles has given us a distillation and reflection upon the evidence, yet still with an immediacy that anyone who even reads the first chapter will see, but which Charles hasn't mentioned, the fact that Charles himself was a cub reporter in Budapest in 1956, and actually from 1953 to 1956. And the book opens with a personal impression, which is extremely moving, and then he adopts the judicious, yet I must emphasize, extremely wry and entertaining tone that he adopts for the rest of the narrative, until he then returns to an event where I'm glad to say I was actually sitting a few tables away on June 16th, 1989. Prague has a reputation for defenestration. They throw people out windows there. Budapest has a reputation for people dumped in mass graves being disinterred and then ceremonially reinterred. I don't know how these cities in Central Europe, have these habits. But in June 1989, it was the time for Imre Nagy and his cohorts, who had been denounced as counter-revolutionary traitors, to be disinterred from Plot 301, I believe it was, and then reinterred in front of a nationally televised audience as national heroes. And Charles was there, tracked by the secret police of the still communist regime, as we later found out. And at the end of the book, the narrative does come full circle. The life that Charles has lived has given him an absolutely unique perspective of both feeling the personal heroism and tragedy of the events, reflected even in his own family, and yet absolutely unparalleled scholarly detachment and skill and knowledge and ability to combine sources, documents, articles, scholarship, but also some extremely intense personal interviews with not only heroes but some less heroic characters from those events, into a narrative which is not definitive. I abhor that word because there's no such thing as definitive for any great event in history, but certainly the most important and authoritative interpretation that has yet appeared. And again, I don't want to take too long, but I just wanted to say a couple of more words. Out there in this audience, and in the implicit audience watching and aware of Charles's book, there are a couple of categories. Anyone who is a historian of the Cold War or of Hungary really couldn't give a damn what I'm saying right now, because this is Charles Gatti's pronouncement on the event, so you have to read it. There's simply no question about it. I mean, this is the book on 1956 to read if you care about the event already. Then there are a lot of others who are sort of interested in a theoretical and vague or a real sense, but you have a lot of other things to do. I ran into Lee Hamilton just before the session, and to take a phrase popularized by the person this building is named after, he's obviously up to his keister in reading about Iraq, terrorism, and other pleasant current subjects. Nevertheless, even if you don't have to read this book, this is an incredibly enlightening but also entertaining and, in contrast to what I tend to produce, mercifully brief book about the events of 1956. Really, there is a stereotype of the wry Central European sensibility, but in Charles's case, it really does come true, because this is an event, you have this grim black and white photograph on the cover, and on a different grim black and white photograph on the cover of the Hungarian edition, which Charles has been selling like hotcakes or chamois cakes in Budapest. But the book itself, though it describes grim events and indeed tragic events, it also comes from a sensibility that looks at human nature, and especially the confrontation between individuals and power in the 20th century. Although I'm a Cold War aficionado and Christian is, this is a book that belongs to the literature of 20th century history in the grandest sense of the struggle of humanity to deal with the rise of totalitarianism and to somehow reconcile power with human rights. And it is also an addition to the literature of revolution. It should be on the same shelf with Crane Brinton and de Tocqueville and other great books about revolutions going back in history. And so while this is a book that must be read for anyone who intrinsically cares about Hungary in 1956, I think it is a book that you will all find worth reading, even if the cast of characters is not necessarily those you would plan to spend the night with. You will come away from Nikita and Matthias and Imre, but most of all with Charles, with a greatly enhanced appreciation for the way it is now possible to understand the history of the Cold War in a way that we just could not have imagined before the past 15 years. So I just want to express again my thanks to Christian for having me here, and most of all to Charles for producing a splendid book, and really the book on the events of a half century ago. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you, Jim. I'd like to open it up for questions and comments. We have about half an hour. Start right down here. If you could please identify yourself and wait for the microphone.
My name is Emil.
If you could please just hold on a second and wait for the microphone.
My name is Emil Simiu. My only credentials are that I was a 22-year-old in Romania at the time of the Hungarian Revolution. And I remember the excitement and the emotion that we all experienced at that time. I remember the extremely efficient actions that the Securitate, the secret police, took to avoid a parallel event in Bucharest, where many students were involved in abortive attempts to do something. My comment is a respectful comment with respect not to your book, which I haven't read, but with respect to Congressman Lantos's explanations. I respectfully submit that it is a bit facile. I don't think it is in the ethnic nature of the Hungarian nation to be impervious to the notion of compromise. I believe that the circumstances at that time were such that an explosion was the oppression that was experienced and perceived by the populations of those countries were such that an explosion was the only thing that could happen. It had happened on June 17th, 1953 in Berlin. It happened in Poland. And as far as the inability of Hungarians to compromise organically, if you will, Kadar is a counterexample. So witty though Congressman Lantos's comments were, I think that they did not really address adequately the substance of your book, or rather of the events. Congressman Lantos left Hungary in 1948. He cannot have a notion of what it meant to live under Rákosi and even under Tito. Thank you.
Thank you. Charles, would you like to?
Well, I tend to agree with you more than I do with my friend Congressman Lantos. No, I don't mean that in any kind of funny way. It is he does have a more romantic vision of Hungarians, and that he constantly, very repeatedly has quoted, and today too, Sándor Petőfi. Well, he was one poet, and it is true that he was and remains popular, but I would like to emphasize the point that you have just made. Kadar ruled Hungary in a calm, limited way, and there is still a lot of nostalgia in free Hungary for the kind of lukewarm goulash communism that he had. It's very hard for those of us who left Hungary in '56 to understand and appreciate the kind of popularity, I have to say, that he still holds. I say this, perhaps a better example is Francis Deák of 1867. Those of you who've been to Budapest and walked down on Andrássy Street or anywhere else, all of that was built during Deák's rule from 1867 till World War I. The best period, I would argue it is the only good period in Hungarian history when constructive work was done rather than heroic positions that did not lead anywhere. I write in the book about this. I have a few sentences when I say that, I don't have it here in front of me, when I say something to the effect that Hungarians like their failed heroes. And I think that was reflected by Congressman Lantos's very serious and very important comments. I think he does reflect, his views are reflected among Hungarians, but I would argue that the other perspective, the one that you mentioned, whether it is Deák or France, the compromisers, I think that is probably equally present in Hungarian political culture. Perhaps I'll stop here.
Yeah, Jim?
Yeah, I just want to mention that the comment raises a very important dimension that some of you might want to pursue, not only in Charles's book, but the writings of someone that Charles and I both respect very much, Mark Kramer, which is the whole question of to what extent the events in Hungary and Poland simultaneously were spilling over throughout the rest of Eastern Europe and even within the Soviet Union itself. And of course, since all criticism of what happened is essentially counterfactual speculation, of course, to be raised is the question that even had the Hungarians managed to achieve more or less what the Poles did by accepting a more limited outcome, would the ensuing chain reaction, as others proceeded to test how far they could go, have been something that could have been contained and allowed to smoothly flow into a détente, as you implied? Or would sooner or later Khrushchev have been forced to simply stop the process short of allowing 1989 to happen in 1956? And that's something it's impossible to determine, but can't be determined simply from analyzing what happens in Hungary itself.
Okay. Go to Hope Harrison right here, and then over here was
Harrison from George Washington University. I haven't read the book yet, but I look forward to it. Since you just returned from a book tour in Hungary, and I'm very interested in how countries deal with their own historical memory, I'd be very interested for you to tell us how is the book being received there, and particularly the part where you say, that the Hungarians themselves could have done things differently. Are people ready to accept this, or is there resistance of that? How do people view your book?
I love you for that question. Yes, I just came back. The Hungarian edition came out a week ago yesterday, and it's sold out in 36 hours. I don't know if I need to add anything to that. The reviews, well, they're not all out yet, but 2 reviews that the U.S. Embassy translated for me as well. Not for me, I can read the Hungarian, but I wanted to make sure my wife reads all those nice things about me. So there was a book signing in a bookstore, some 300 plus people lined up there, and for me to sign it. And I talked to each one of them at least for a second or two, and if there was anything there that I remember as typical, there is no such thing as a typical comment. It was, finally somebody tells us what we did wrong. Very interesting. Now, there will be, historians who have not gotten to this, and, there will be a lot of jealousy, no doubt, and some very reasonable criticism. At the introduction, where the book was launched, and perhaps the most prominent historian of 56, Professor or Dr. Reiner, I don't know if he teaches, János Reiner, made some comments, very important, and some of that critical, For example, having to do with, in case you're interested, the kind of evidence that I have about the Soviet decision on October 30th to against military intervention. He thought it was weak evidence. I mean, it is in the Malin notes, but it's not enough, he thinks, that we should have more. He thought that I give too much emphasis to the massacre on Republic Square that very day, that I argue one of the 3 or 4 things that made the Soviet Politburo change its mind. But this is, and somebody just sent me, whom I don't even know. I met him only once. Another very prominent historian, Laszlo Varga, sent me an advance copy of a very long, full-page review that's coming out in a weekly, and it's absolutely, it's really heartwarming, very, very, very positive. The interesting thing for you, Hope, is how come the Hungarians themselves, though, have not written a book like this? That is the one that I don't fully understand, and I think the answer is one I don't want to believe, which is that if you are that critical of yourself, in effect, of Hungarians, you will not lose your job, but you will not be treated as well as I was treated. Several people said only a foreigner could write this book. And that does not please me, I must say. I mean, I'm glad I wrote the book, but so, 15 years after 89 and 50 years after 56, you still cannot say some things that people will. I mean, I will get criticism here too. I have no illusions about that, as being anti-Hungarian or something. I mean, frankly, I really couldn't care less. But it was very nice, sold out. Technology being what it is, by Friday they had 2,000 extra copies there. And thanks for the question, Hope. Can I tell them how we know each other?
Yeah, please.
She was my student at Columbia University. Question was not planted, however.
Very good. Gentleman up front here, then we'll go to Mr. Richmond in the blue shirt.
I am Charles Soradi. I am not a hyphenated American. I just happen to be a born Hungarian. And I haven't read the book yet. I'm looking forward to it. But I was there in '56 making Molotov cocktails for the uprising. And I worked 7 years for Vas Zoltán, who was the head of the Terhivatal, the Hungarian Gosplan, the equivalent. My comment is that I strongly disagree with Congressman Lantos' comments, because Hungary won't be here today if we would end up with compromise in the similar situation. Hungarian history shows that we stuck our shoulder out and raised our voice, whether it was by Zrínyi in Szigetvár or other places. We always stand up, even for a course when the result was hopeless. That's why I looking forward to read the book, whether how it would reflect, I would agree or disagree with my feeling. But I believe in the Talpra Magyar, and I believe in the
Can you translate?
Talpra Magyar, I think already Congressman Lantos translated with the Hajrá fel Magyar.
It's the same Petőfi theme that he mentioned.
Yeah. My comment is to finish it up properly, that I think Congressman Lantos' comment reflects the Democratic Party liberal views, and he tried to express that view for the Hungarian uprising, which I think is not a correct approach. it's true that I happen to be a Republican, but don't hold that against me.
Thank you. Fortunately, Congressman Lantos is not here to respond to this. We'll go to Yale Richmond. Mr. Richmond.
Retired Foreign Service officer who worked on Eastern Europe for many years. In your book, do you have any explanation for why the situation in Poland developed so differently from that in Hungary, and why the Poles were able to settle for half a loaf or three-quarters of a loaf, which enabled them to change the internal situation in Poland? They ended the collectivization of agriculture. They opened up the academics to freedom of speech. They ended overt harassment of the Catholic Church. Why did the Poles, despite their long history of uprisings against Russia, settle for half a loaf, and the Hungarians did not?
Thank you. Very important question. Speaking of, a romantic political culture, nothing is more romantic than Polish political culture. And Hungarians are, a close second, but not quite there. I would say that there were three reasons for the difference. One had to do with Cardinal Wyszynski, who had just gotten out of jail and who understood the situation, that Gomulka was the best they could get, and he mobilized the single most important force in Polish society, which was the Catholic Church, and he supported it. Number two, in Munich, Radio Free Europe had Jan Nowak as the head of the Polish desk, and he was a man of immense intelligence. Probably several of you knew him, passed away just a couple of years ago. And he understood the situation, and he had enough leeway from Bill Griffith, the head of RFE, or the political advisor at RFE, to do it his way. So I would say those two factors. And he implicitly urged Poles to support Gomulka. And I would say the third reason, maybe the most important, I can't decide, was that in the Polish Communist Party, the leaders stepped aside. Notably, Ohab stepped aside and allowed Gomulka to take over, while in Hungary, none of these things happened. Cardinal Mindszenty showed up late, and then he made a speech. Lots of people criticized him for it. Actually, by then it made no difference at all. But he was no Cardinal Wyszynski, for sure. The Hungarian radio desk at RFE I think was not as nearly as calm, to put it really diplomatically, as the Polish desk, and some of it was inflammatory. Some of their broadcasts definitely was inflammatory. Some was less so, but it got out of hand. And as Congressman Lantos mentioned, they even gave lessons on how to make Molotov cocktails. And thirdly, the Stalinist leadership at party headquarters, led by Ernő Gerő, acted stupidly against their own interests. They had to escape, and they did not give way to Imre Nagy early enough, who I think could have calmed the situation. Those would be the three reasons that I would give you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would just add one other factor that is still not entirely clear, and that is the possibility that actually Hungary saved Poland, in the following sense, that the Hungarian uprising actually began as a gesture of support for the Poles. And of course, in the immediately preceding days, Khrushchev had brought the Presidium en masse to Warsaw to pressure Gomulka. And Gomulka had reassured him that although he wanted some reforms, like kicking out the Polish defense minister, who was actually a Soviet citizen, and kicking Soviet secret police out of the military intelligence infrastructure and things like that, during a very tense standoff at the airport, one of our favorite scholars, Mark Kramer, believes that even though Gomulka reassured Khrushchev that he wanted a more autonomous communist regime, but he would remain faithful to the Soviet alliance and the Warsaw Pact, that although Khrushchev went back to Moscow, he was still not entirely satisfied and had by no means ruled out the possibility of military intervention. But that during consideration of what to do about Poland, the Hungarian crisis came up. And suddenly that flared into a more serious crisis, and that sort of took off the shelf the idea of invading Poland, since they at least seem to have a more or less acceptable status quo there. But the interrelationship between those two crises in terms of Soviet decision-making is something that's still being explored.
On precisely that question, we will have on October 12th one of Poland's finest and brightest young historians, Krzysztof Persak from the Institute of National Remembrance here from 4 to 5:30. So if you're interested in the Polish experience and the connection between the Polish and Hungarian crisis, join us on October 12th. The information is on our website, and you can RSVP electronically that way. All right, who's next? Jerry Livingston in the center. And then the gentleman, right, we'll go. First Dr. Livingston, and then we'll go to the gentleman right behind.
I'm Jerry Livingston from the German Historical Institute. Listening to Charles Gatti and to Congressman Lantos reminds one of this sign in front of some Hollywood studio in the late 1930s when there were a lot of Hungarian screenwriters and directors. It's not enough to be Hungarian. You also have to have talent. My question, I have a question for Professor...
Wait a second, would you elaborate on this?
It's before my time. My question to Professor Gatti, and also I think to Christian and to Professor Hirschberg, is the following. Were there anticipations on the part of the Hungarian revolutionaries that the Americans would help them in some way? And how great were those anticipations? And if I can put it to you, Christian, and to you, Professor Hirschberg, of course you've written about the June 17th, 53 revolt. Were there any anticipations on the part of those who rose up in East Berlin and elsewhere in East Germany that the Americans would come to their aid?
Very, very difficult question to answer. Certainly neither before nor during the revolution did the United States officially or Radio Free Europe or the Voice of America offer military assistance. I have listened to the broadcast during the revolution, which is a lot of hours of listening, and that just simply is a myth. It did not happen. But throughout those years, we offered hope, and those who listened could easily take hope for help. And therefore, I rather sympathize with the Hungarians who are disappointed to this day that there was no assistance of some sort. Not necessarily intervention, but something. And I rather tend to agree with that you cannot keep offering hope without offering some help. And so in that sense, we made a terrible mistake in my judgment. In our propaganda, it's unfair, it is unnecessary too. Although, as you heard the Nixon quote, perhaps there were some people who calculated that weakening the Soviet Empire ultimately is good for the people of the Soviet Empire. I could make that argument in a classroom, but as a human being, I really can't do that, and it doesn't show up too much in my book either.
I have little to add to that other than, I would certainly agree that the rollback and liberation rhetoric, I'm sure, inspired some unrealistic expectations among those who were revolting, but I doubt any of them actually acted because they expected the American cavalry to come in and rescue them. I'm sure some of them were disappointed, but I think it is indeed a myth that was why the events took place.
Thank you. We'll go. Okay.
My name is George Pick, and my credential is that I was there also in '56, and I would like to take a position where I agree both with Professor Gatti and Tom Lantos, and this position actually is not necessarily contradictory. I was at the parliament when the revolution started. In fact, I was there a night before during the Technical University revolution, which started roughly 15 hours before the official. And I know that we got caught up very well with the emotion of the moment. And I think once one gets caught up, one loses the feeling of what is rational and what is not, and what is expected and what is not. So I agree with Lantos that yes, when you have a revolution, you lose your greater perspective. I agree with Professor Gatti that they could have done something different. However, what they could have done and what they did were two different things, and I regard history as past, not what if. Okay? And the second thing, which is really related, is the question, two questions. One question is, how much did the Suez crisis made a difference in the Russian decision in Moscow whether to or not to attack Hungary? That's the first question. And the second, does he think, or do you think that because the inaction of the world and the West in a Hungarian situation, that made it impossible for the Czechs to have their revolution, which was in 1968. In other words, did the Russians learn from the West's inaction in 56, which they and then translated to getting rid of the democracy with the human face in Czechoslovakia? Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. And
just briefly, the importance of Suez has been exaggerated. Certainly, though you didn't ask me that question, the United States would not have done anything differently during the Hungarian crisis if there had been no Suez crisis. Of that I am certain, simply because we did not have the means at our disposal to do something. There was no, I mean, one of the saddest or funniest things was that a high-ranking CIA official was at the Austro-Hungarian border on the Austrian side, I'd like to say, because he got no permission from the White House to enter Hungarian territory. And even though he was told there will be no assistance, he wanted to know from his own people, his own staff, whether there were any weapons hidden in Western Europe in case the White House changes its mind. And I know that most of you will not believe this, and until I read it, I didn't believe it for sure. It took the staff 1 full month after the intervention on November 4th, which is to say the first week of December, to locate the weapons that had been hidden. And unfortunately, where they were hidden was deleted on the page where I got it, but it's very clear, you can guess, it was probably in West Germany somewhere. So, in other words, there was a lot of inefficiency as well, but we had nothing to, there was a small Hungarian contingent prepared, I believe either by the Defense Department, I think by the Pentagon, maybe by the agency, I don't know that, in case we'd want to, get involved. I believe there were 8 people so trained, and the little contingent was disbanded in 1952 or 1953 because there was greater need to transfer resources to the Far East on account of the Korean crisis. So Suez made no difference for the United States. I know that wasn't your question, but I thought that I would relate this. As far as the Soviet Union, the evidence is not so clear because in the Malin notes there is a reference or two that Khrushchev mentioned Suez, not in the context that you imply, which is to say now that they are busy, this is the time to get involved. That they don't say. If they did, then I could give you a definite answer. It's mentioned. It's not quite clear. It's mentioned in a way that, well, those imperialists are just awful, and we shouldn't let them think that we can be pushed around. But that had to do with Egypt more than Hungary. So I'm not clear how to read the Malin notes on this. But it's possible that the timing of the Soviet intervention might have had something to do with Suez. Probably not very much. Briefly, the Czech, I don't think that the United they knew in '56 too that the United States was not intervening militarily in Hungary, and they knew it in '68 as well.
Yes, on the issue of Suez, Charles and I I think, slightly disagreed on its likely significance and just the possibility of such a question. I just want to read the one reference in the Malin notes, and again, for all of you, V.M. Malin was the recording.
He always comes prepared.
The recording secretary for Nikita Khrushchev, and his handwritten minutes have now been released in Russia, and there's a fat volume of them in Russian that has been published, and some selected ones have been translated. And if you look at the copies of Bulletin 8-9, which are on the desk outside and on the web, you can read the Malin notes from October, November 1956 on the Hungarian events, and they're absolutely riveting. It's the closest we have to the XCOM minutes for the Soviet side of a major Cold War crisis. But the key passage is on 31 October, the day after there had been this seeming decision to, at least tentatively accept not going back into Hungary, and that's also when Pravda is given this declaration acknowledging errors in relations between the Soviet Union and other socialist states. And then 24 hours later, there's this reversal and decision that they must invade Hungary. And during that discussion, Khrushchev says, if we depart from Hungary, it will give a great boost to the Americans, English, and French, the imperialists. They will perceive it as weakness on our part and will go on to the offensive. We would then be exposing the weakness of our positions. Our party will not accept it if we do it. To Egypt, the imperialists will then add Hungary. And what's so fascinating about this is it goes to the question of contingency in history, not only that there just happened to be this concurrence of Suez with Hungary, but clearly Khrushchev on October 31st is laboring under a misperception that Eisenhower is actually supporting the Anglo-French intervention in Suez, which on that day looked like it would be successful and would undermine Nasser. He didn't realize that actually Eisenhower was completely against it and was going to force the British and the French out. But at that moment, what you can almost postulate is this reverse mirror imaging of Khrushchev seeing dominoes falling in reverse and seeing a process that had to be stopped. If there's no Suez, and he doesn't see to Egypt they will add Hungary, might he have been more willing to swallow some more limited defeat? But the evidence is far from certain on this.
Thank you. I know there are at least half a dozen additional questions out there, but I'd like to recognize Ambassador Shimony, who has been patiently waiting, and I'd like to give him the last word for this session, or almost last word.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I don't think
Microphone.
Oh. First of all, thank you so much, Christian and Jim, for doing this. And, of course, first and foremost, Charles, thank you for giving us this book. This is a fascinating discussion. It's fascinating to hear those who have been part of the revolution, and it's fascinating to hear some others who have not been there but are knowledgeable about the revolution. It's also fascinating that Lantos brought up this whole debate about revolution versus reform. And honestly, I don't have no idea where I stand on this. Now, even if I did have a position, don't forget I'm one of his clients, so I'm not going to tell you what I wouldn't tell you what I mean. But this is a great book. It's an honest, decent, professional, well-written book. It is probably the best book so far written about the 1956 revolution. It takes away some of our illusions. I'm not sure all our illusions were failures, but your book takes away most of the illusions. I want to congratulate you for downsizing Imre Nagy to make him human. You are protecting him from all what has been hyped upon him throughout the years. And thank you for coming out with Imre Nagy as a hero, as a real Hungarian, honest, decent hero. All I wish, now you've opened the floodgates, because your book, and I have had the opportunity to have long discussions with Charles Karcsiba, as I call him, Hungarian. Most recently, we spent 3 hours discussing the book. And I told him that you opened the floodgates because we will have to have a different take on what came after 1956. After this book, you cannot, but you will have to have a totally different take on what happened afterwards. Reform versus revolution. What was the impact of 1956? Why were we able to do the 68 reforms, radical reforms, while the Soviets were crushing the Czech Revolution? All these questions will be asked after your book. It's a marvelous book. It took me 2 days to read it. Tom's just so much smarter than I am. But I also read the small print, and I want to thank you once again. I want to thank you, Charlie. I want to thank your wife, Toby, for being so patient, giving us Hungarians a very honest book. One last comment. You are as Hungarian as I am, so don't try to escape that. And it's good that a Hungarian wrote a book like this. Thank you.
Thank you. I think this is a great note to end on. Let me just thank Charles for his presentation and congratulations on your landmark study. Thanks to Jim Hirschberg and Congressman Lantos. I'd like to invite you now over to our Moynihan boardroom for a little reception, some wine, and an opportunity to get your book signed. The book is available at a discount for sale outside. I'd like to ask you to let...
Show this to them. Show.
All right. This is the Hungarian version that just sold out, and I'm told it will also appear in a Russian and Polish version. Let me ask you to allow Professor Gatti to go to the boardroom. We've set up a table where he can more comfortably sign books, and I'd like to invite you all to our reception. Thank you for coming. Hey, nice to meet you. Nice to meet you.